Leadership. All my life, I've been fascinated by what makes a good leader. Are good leaders born or made? Can leadership be taught? How do leaders lead if people don't trust to even listen? I grew up in Arkansas. Now I live and work in the innovation heartland of Northern California. During these past years of constant crisis, I've thought more deeply about leadership and what it takes to lead people, especially when trust is in limited supply. That's why I decided to create this podcast and reach out to changemakers from different disciplines to hear what they have to say. As the host of this show, the most important things I can do are two things I learned in medical school: to ask good questions and then listen. Hello, I'm Lloyd Minor, Dean of the Stanford School of Medicine, and welcome back to the Minor Consult. It's my privilege to welcome this week's guest, Oscar Muñoz, former CEO of United Airlines. Over the course of his successful career as a business executive, Oscar has served as a senior leader at some of the world's largest corporations, including PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, AT&T, and CSX, in addition to United. He's helped shape these companies with his sharp acumen, strong leadership, and personable management style. Known for listening to employees and putting their needs first. I'm sure he has a lot to tell us. Thank you so much for joining me, Oscar.
Well, Dean, very nice to be here. I much appreciate it.
I know you grew up in Southern California, your parents having immigrated here. Oscar, can you tell me about your background and how it influenced your life and career?
Oh boy, what a great opening question. I'm such a storyteller, and there's always so many stories to our life, right? And I find it's the best way to convey any kind of messages. Many influences, of course, but I think predominantly, and the one I speak to, and probably that's most personal and touching to my heart, and is the story of my abuelita, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. When I was young, my mom actually left Mexico. I was born in Mexico. She left me in Mexico in the care of my grandmother while she went up and joined my older uncle, her older brother, who had legally immigrated her to try to make a living in El Norte, as we called it, the North. And so I spent the formative years up till second, almost third grade with my grandmother alone, sort of going from home to home of different family members in Mexico. And it's such a wonderful story because as how it shaped me, what I learned over many years was she ended up being a maid at a large hotel in Las Vegas at the end of her life. She also immigrated here. But what I learned about her is in the time that I was with her and all that she went through, and then when she had a going away party from the hotel chain, the amount of people that showed up, not just her peers but the managers and the people in suits, and the stories I heard about her background and history really touched me in the sense because I just knew her as my grandmother. Mama Josefina was her name. And what we learned also, she retired at 86 and passed away at a ripe age of 96. And for her last few years, she was in a home, and physically her ankles had fused together because of the arthritic condition she had endured for probably 20 years. The long story short is never once in the entire time I knew her, when we were walking the dusty streets in Mexico, trying to meet with our next family, to the many travels we did, to all the trials and tribulations in her life, through her physical pain, through this arthritic condition, she never once, and I mean never once, sent a message of complaining. I always get a little emotional with this because in my worst days, right, I think of her and what she's gone through and how she never had a bad word for anyone, and the incredible sentiment and emotions expressed at her going away function by all these senior leaders, that you really learn what a truly special woman she is. And the connectedness she had with others really laid for me a groundswell, a foundation of how I should act and interact and understand the people that work around me, because my situation was different. A quick funny story, she was kind of old school. So she would ask me what I was doing. And I think the one time I remember vividly, I was the CFO of Coca-Cola Enterprises. And she asked, oh, she doesn't know what that means, of course. Like, what do you mean? What does that do? She goes, well, I tried to explain the concept of the role of a CFO. And if you could see the look on her face, because in her world, right, working, like let's say at Coke, meant you produced it, you delivered it, right? That was work. What I did was sit behind a desk and do whatever I was saying. And she had this knowing, wonderful, but loving and supportive smile, like mijo, which is a term of endearment. She's like, well, he must not be so smart if they have him behind a desk. So it was just one of those things that always has kept me grounded to the person I am. And I think that's the wonderful thing about all our heritage, and particularly for me, for my Mexican heritage, is just knowing her background and her history really makes me impacted. So that was probably one of the bigger influences. And of course, many, many more people that show up in your life, but I'm sure we can talk about that on different set.
So your grandmother was certainly, as you described, an inspiration. She exemplified the type of values that you've brought in your business career. As you moved, in your career, as you moved from your education into the business world, who did you seek out as mentors, and what were the characteristics of the people who were most impactful in the various industries and businesses and companies you were in? They were impactful in helping you build your career and develop your skills and abilities as a business executive.
To answer the question directly would do injustice to the fact of what mentors mean and why people provide you guidance and direction. There's a great Tennyson quote in this poem Ulysses, which it says, "I am part of all that I have met." And I just always find that really personal, because as I think about all those situations and all the different people that I've been through, my grandmother is certainly one of those. But in my workspace, somehow, some way, there was always somebody in my life around me, a supervisor, a peer, who took the time and the wherewithal to sort of sit me down apart from everyone else and sort of gently suggest that I might want to do something different. One of the most memorable ones was an old boss. I had moved from Pepsi Cola to Coca-Cola at a very young age for a very high role that I took as a very young person, and it spent some few months there. And I'm having my mid-year review, and my boss is basically saying all the things. You're great. I took a chance on you. You've over-delivered, exceeded our expectations. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. I was feeling pretty good about myself. I think I was 26 or 27 at the time. And then I remember this vividly. He closes the HR document and sort of pushes it aside and says, it's like, now that we got this site, Oscar, if you don't mind, could we talk just as friends, as people? And I'm thinking, because I was an arrogant little thing, so, he probably wants me to date his daughter or something, right? He said one of the more impactful statements that has really helped me course correct in my life. He said, Oscar, you're great. You've delivered, you exceeded all the things he had just said. Because, but if I had to give you advice more as a friend, he goes, and he said the magic words, "You're not yet as good as you think you are." And I'm like, sitting there, I remember sitting there kind of in shock, like, I'm sorry, that didn't quite sound like I want you to date my daughter. And you could see kind of this spear of feedback hitting me in the chest. And of course, what he meant was, slow your roll, buddy. You're great and you're going to be terrific, but if you just allow people. And the interesting part about moving from Pepsi to Coke is, just like you would think Pepsi is kind of a New York company and Coke is a very genteel Southern Atlanta company, I think the people sort of represented that same thing inside the companies. So it was a lot older people at Coca-Cola than there were in my growing up at Pepsi. And so I tended to disregard what was obviously intellect, experience, knowledge, and importantly, a lot of people's willingness to help your ass out. And I neglected to do that because I was what I call all asses and elbows, right? I'm this young, brash, smart kid. I know how to do all of this stuff. And his phrase, "You're not yet as good as you think you are," really, it did not feel good. And in fact, it hurt. And I went through the seven stages of grief, eventually accepting the fact that all I needed to do was slow down a little bit and understand. And it really, really helped my career even get on a bigger trajectory.
Have you used what you learned from that interaction at the age of 26 that you just described? As you have mentored young people in your leadership roles, have you had similar conversations, and how have you found that they responded?
The answer is, of course, yes. I mean, we all pay it forward in some way, shape, or form. And, I find that feedback, honest, direct feedback, um, sometimes lacks, especially people that are very highly qualified and then moved up. And, they either are moving so fast or leaders are not willing to take the time to have that type of conversation, or for whatever reasons, people often get to a very senior level without ever having heard some of those things. Because of that background, I have spoken to many of my teams, and I'm almost batting 1,000 when I say something to someone. Like if you and I were talking, I say, Dean, this, and this, right? You wear Stanford colors just a way too much, and you should think about USC colors more. I'm kidding. um, but it's usually something more personal and a dynamic and a human dynamic that you convey to others. It tends to be my focus of feedback. Other than you're not really smart, you're not really doing your work. That's more tactical. I tend to understand and observe a person and have a meaningful conversation like what was had for me. And I have had so many conversations where people are slightly taken aback. By the way, that is not the intent at all. But it
Sure,
is intent
sure.
says, listen, I know people haven't told you. I know you've reached executive vice president and all these levels, but here's a couple little things. And then I always add a little thing, like, don't take my word for it. I said, please go home, talk to a loved one, talk to a family member, talk to someone you trust, and literally start the conversation with a phrase like, I was at work and this crazy new boss I have, or this crazy new peer I have, said this to me. What do you think? And I always say, wait for just a nanosecond and watch and see their reaction. And I'm telling you, Dean, I think I'm batting 1,000 on this one. Never has anybody come back and said, yeah, my wife said you're crazy or my husband said you're nuts. They've all come back and said, wow, I said those words and my loved one said, well, dear, you could do a little more of this or that. And that's when you've hit the point.
Fantastic. When you became CEO at United, you became only one of 9 Hispanic CEOs leading Fortune 500 companies. How do we grow the diversity of leadership in U.S. businesses?
It is such a topic today, right? And I think in my business lifetime, I am probably seeing more what I call proof, not promise, with regards to initiatives. For so long, I think everybody meant well, but there was more lip service, and there was a heightened level of engagement by people, and then it just trailed off into everything. And then everybody would talk to each other, and it's like, well, company X is doing this, let's do that. Company, and so everyone would have a structure. So when asked the question about what you did, everybody could, sort of rattle off all these things you were doing. But rarely do we talk about metrics, specificity. Specificity means what is good for my organization and my company. And so progression is there. I was proud of corporate America. I think the summer that we had with regards to the racial unrest, we were a part of the pandemic, and we are also having this issue. And the Business Roundtable, the Association of CEOs and Business Council, our conversations at least once a week were about one of those two topics and the meaningful nature upon which corporate America undertook to really understand. And so you've seen African American directors and boards rise to almost 28% from their 12, 13% population. You've seen Hispanics, Latinos go from 2 to 4%, despite our 18% part of the population. So we got much work to do. So that's been going on. My advice, my counsel on all these fronts, because I think the usual conversation that you have is like, no, we really believe in that, but Oscar, we just can't find someone. We don't have we don't see that. We're creating the pipeline and we're starting to do this. And I think, of course, that's part of the equation. Here's my advice and counsel that I give, and I use myself as an example. Most boards, especially meaningful boards in America and corporate big companies, they already have a well-established, incredibly well-respected and experienced group of board members at 10, 12, 14, different numbers. There's always an opportunity for one board member to be younger, less experienced, and can learn from all this wisdom that's already in the room. And I say, don't wait for someone to become a former CEO to put him or her on your board, because they're underrepresented, a minority. There's a chance to take it. So I was brought onto the Continental board at a very ripe age. I had my first job as a public company CFO, and I met with them and they brought me on. And the board was filled with all of this great talent. And so for a period of time, learning from my friend Mike Bell 100 years ago would just kind of, slow roll it. I just sat and learned from folks, and I became a better board member. Inevitably, I became the CEO of the company, interestingly enough. But again, it all started with the opportunity and taking a bit of a chance on someone that maybe quite hasn't accomplished everything you want them to accomplish. And again, I don't ask for boards to take down their standard in any way. I'm just saying you already have a high-class blue chip board. It's okay to let someone in. And I think that's a great way to grow talent and take the initiative, as opposed to waiting for all the right things to fit into place.
Based on your decades of experience, what advice would you give to rising executives from underrepresented backgrounds who aspire to leadership roles? You talked some about the advice you got as a 26-year-old, but in general, what are the principles you would suggest that they keep in mind?
I am very frank and direct on this topic because I think too many people provide more broad platitudes of sorts that are meaningful and probably have value. But you also have to understand that even today, in this day and age, with all that we know and possess and information that's in front of us, bias, racial bias in particular, sexual bias to some degree, still exists. I see it. I travel in a lot of very elite circles. I'm with people in their quiet moments when there's no one around. I hear it, I see it, I feel it. And so it still exists. It's not as obvious and it's not as apparent, but it is indeed happening. It's a fact. People are working on that. So that's happening. The aspect of what I tell folks in underrepresented minorities is that understand that it's out there. And because it's out there, we can all stand and yell and scream that you need to pay attention to me more, give me more, or you can do to some degree what I and many others in my generation, including yourself, have done. You just work and work hard and do the right things for your peers, for the people above you, and then hope there's somebody in your leadership group that says, hey, there's a very talented human being. It happens to be a she. It happens to be someone of a different color. It doesn't matter. But what they're witnessing is the clarity. I live this next phase of my life to enrich others by proving the value of human diversity is in and actually in its output, not just doing it and just saying, well, I have somebody that happens to be this or that. And so for the people, there was one of the first African-American pilots at United, a guy named Bill Norwood, wonderful person. He said a long time ago, he grew up in Alabama, in segregation, Alabama, a long time ago. And he said, the fact of the matter is that we have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And I always stuck with that when he told me, because it's like, you know what, I'm always going to work twice as hard, but damn it if I'm not going to help people get further than half as far. And there's a degree of personal ownership in our lives, especially in our younger community. Hey, life sucks. There's going to be a lot of unfair things, whether it's racial bias, whether it's 1,000 other things that people are going to hold against you. One thing you can do for yourself is focus, do your work, do it well, don't expect handouts. And through that process, you will enrich your life and the lives of your class in a lot of ways. I am often referred to as the first Hispanic. I get all these, these laudable mentions of being what is indeed the exception, right? There's the one person that's like, well, hell, I don't want to be the exception. I don't want my next generation of my cohort or any cohort to be the exception, but rather to have those younger people drive this emotional thing that says, you know what, I don't want to be the exception. I want to be the expectation. That people expect someone to be, to be a doctor, to be an astronaut, to be a CEO.
That's great. Switching gears to your time at United, you famously began your tenure as CEO with a listening tour, visiting employees all over the country, all over the world. And can you share more about that experience and what you learned from listening to your new cohort of executives and employees?
the premise for that listening tour is twofold. One, it is a little bit of a vestige for my grandmother, right, and my heritage. We just, as a family, we just didn't dive into something. We always asked somebody how they were feeling and why they were feeling it. So I learned that from a personal perspective. And from a business aspect, and this is a lesson for us all, especially taking over United in its state that it was, because people were disenfranchised, disengaged, disillusioned, and we were performing badly on every metric you could possibly measure a corporation by. And so it's easy to say that in highlights, but all of that was true. And what I've learned in all my life, and it's not the first turnaround that I've gone through, the key to a good turnaround story is that you begin with the right thing. What is the foundational issue that you're going to work on first, upon which everything else can sort of build upon? Because there's never a shortage of things that are wrong. There's never a shortage of people giving you advice as to what you might fix first, right? I was surrounded by reams of analytics and consultant documents and my leadership saying, well, Oscar, here's what we got to fix. No, we got to do this. We got to do this. And it was disparate, as you can imagine, which is what led me to the importance of this listening tour. In my first earnings call, everybody's like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Are you going to fix this? Are you going to fix that? And of course, customers want specific things. The financial community certainly wants things that, hey, you're going to make more money. And, I walk in out from sort of outside the industry, say, you know what? I'm not exactly sure, but give me 60 to 90 days and I'm going to go find out exactly what ails us. And I'm going to do it from that ground level. I'm going to talk to the people that actually provide you, the customers, the service, that provide the safety that's provide all, and I'm going to listen to them. And part of my mind says, I can't believe I'm saying this because I'm going to have to go out there and I'm going to have to figure something out because you're going to get a lot of things. And so that was the genesis of that listening tour. I dub it listen, learn, and then only lead after that. And it sounds trite, but listening requires a level of listening that you've never heard. The learning part is you think you've heard something, go back and ask again, and you'll learn that it's not exactly right. All the communication things we've all learned in business school about how to do that, you have to really employ them. And by the way, in a genuine way. So the side story and the meaningful story, and I think the story that really, I think, is the bedrock of United's big turnaround story was, so after 36 days of doing this, and I'm talking like 24 hours a day. I mean, an airline never stops. So I had more pizza at 2:00 in the morning with teams, and I have stories. We're writing a book, and I'm telling many of these stories about those early days. But where it really culminated, I'm heading back to Denver. I mean, I'm heading back from Denver to California to Chicago, and my style of asking questions is not very particularly. It's not based on anything other than I walk up to you and say, "How you doing? Like, what's up? And how you doing?" So I want a meaningful, what is really. There's no really long question. And the flight attendant that was on my flight, when I turned, she was in the galley, and I turned to see her, and I said, "Hi, I'm Oscar." She goes, "I know who you are." I said, I know what you're doing. And I said, and before I said anything, she broke down in tears. And she said the magic words that will forever live in United lore. She said, Mr. Muñoz, I'm just tired of always having to say, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. And it was profound in the sense because for 36 days, I'm freaking out because I've learned everything. I've got in my mind and in my notes, a gazillion, even more things than I had before. How am I going to dissect this? How am I going to convert this into something that's thoughtful that I can lead the company with? That was the culminating moment because it's like, oh my God, that's it. I'm sorry we're not on time. I'm sorry we have bad coffee. I'm sorry Wi-Fi doesn't work. I'm sorry, right? We weren't giving our very own customer, our very own employees, the tools and the wherewithal to actually make their lives and the lives of our customers better. So that all led in a lot of long stories to the concept of our North Star became regain the trust of our employees as the first thing. Now, employees were like, yes, that's my man right there. He gets us. Customers are like, what the hell? And I won't even tell you about our investors, right? Because they're like, whoa, wait a second. What does that mean? That doesn't mean like we're going to fly more places and make more money. That sounds like you're going to spend it. But it was the right thing to do, and it was the right foundation that launched what ended up being what was United, the new spirit of United, as I've dubbed it.
That's such a revealing comment, and it says everything, doesn't it? I'm just tired of having to say I'm sorry. Then, how did you get from, and certainly that was the ethos that you emphasized in the turnaround, but how did you get from that into actionable plans to improve operations and the other things that have been talked about and written about so much because of the foundation you established? So how did you make that transition from listening and from getting the ideas and from seeing that there was a yearning to be a better organization to actually implementing it and leading to actions?
Again, a long story. I'll be as brief as I can. So certainly, once you think you have an idea about where it's happening, from a leadership perspective, the first thing is to get others to think and feel the same way. And by influencing, not by telling, by suggesting and providing facts and data and letting them come to the conclusion rather than by telling. So that was going to take a little bit of time. Unfortunately, as soon as I started that process, because on the 37th day of my work, when I got back to Chicago, I suffered a nearly fatal heart attack that we can talk about separately. So I had to take a little bit of a hiatus for a few weeks, and then had a heart transplant that came back. But again, right before I got my heart transplant, I had my leadership team together, and we were talking about this very subject. Not only my findings, but their views. As I interviewed the people at the ground level, I was now in effect interviewing all my senior executives at a 3-day strategy event. And as part of that process, we were asking the same question. And in a weird turn of events and fate and I don't know what else you might call it, on the day that I got a call that there was a new heart ready to replace my old one, the evening before, we had come to a conclusion about this concept of regaining the trust of our employees. And then the next morning, we talked about it, and the executive senior team determined that, yes, that's exactly what we have to do. So my job was sort of done, to answer your question. And then I did some famous speech as I left at lunch. I said, hey, guys, I got to go to the hospital. There's this thing I've been waiting for. And I remember saying, I'll see you on the other side, as a kind of a flippant comment. And then looking back on it, realizing the double entendre, it's like, well, which side, right? Because I could have easily gone off into into the next life, so to speak. But so the premise behind that is, once you think you have the idea, allowing others to do that. And then, more importantly, once the senior team got behind it, that we were going to regain the trust, it was really an easy concept. It's like, let's go out to our employees and listen to them. You listen to them, and let's see how we can regain trust. I have great stories. Our CFO went to a place, and they didn't have a lot to say other than, you know what? We've been asking for a small refrigerator for our break room to put our food in while we're working all day. Well, Jerry Latterman, our CFO, went out himself to some store and bought a small refrigerator, brought it himself in that day, didn't expend it, was just here. And so many stories like that, obviously with much major, more impactful situations of investment, but nevertheless, that's how it regained it. The beauty of all of that is once you get everybody behind you, you don't have to go put specific tactical or strategic thoughts. These people whose hearts now, we've captured not only their hearts and their minds, well, now they're ready to go to work. They have the North Star. They know what we're headed for.
Oscar, can you describe your experiences having suffered a major heart attack and then a heart transplant? What advice do you have? You've been very active in the American Heart Association, other organizations, talking about your experiences and encouraging others to do the right thing. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, I'd love to. I think it's an important message that I give to others because it can help save lives, and I think it's an important issue. My personal story, as a triathlete, marathon runner, vegan, on top of this, I found myself at least eating healthy and exercising. Obviously, leading a very busy life. But one fateful morning, I suffered something that I couldn't describe at the time. And when I go back in time, one of my partners in running is a cardiologist, and he'd always tell me, this group of us, this very simple story. He says, you know what? Some of the youngest and fittest people are the ones that die on my operating table, which I thought was a little dramatic. And then his point would be, It's like you can't, a heart attack can happen to anyone, right? It's DNA. It's not just how you look. It's not because you're heavy. It's not because of your lifestyle. There's so much internal plumbing that could be easy. And then he added this phrase that says, if you ever feel anything weird, and he used the term weird in your body, immediately call 911. It may be indigestion, it may be anything. And the worst thing that can happen, it's one of those things. But, he says, but when you reach 911, he says, immediately tell them where you are, which I remember thinking, it's like, duh. I mean, what else would you do? And he goes, but he said, because you may not make it past the phone call. And I remember vividly thinking, wow, that was really dramatic. His name is Mark. And so that was in the back of my head. So back to this fateful morning, I had gone out for a quick run. I was back in my apartment by myself on the 48th floor of a Chicago high-rise, making my vegan protein shake. I heard my phone buzzing across the room. And as I walked to get it, my legs sort of gave out. And I reached for a counter, held myself up. And I remember saying in my head, wow, that was weird. And the phone, of course, kept ringing. And as I sort of went again, my legs completely gave out from me. And I felt a little clammy. And his words came rushing back to me. I found my landline, for those people that know what that is. And I dialed immediately 911. And I immediately told them where they were. Because, again, being on the 48th floor of a high rise, your cell phone is not going to tell them enough of the information that you need. And so, long story short, so many wonderful miracle moments. The EMTs were literally outside returning from another trip, so they were pulled in immediately. Within 38 minutes of them getting me and sending me to Northwestern Hospital, I was on life support. I was in a medically induced coma. If I had had 5 more minutes to live or 10 minutes, nobody will ever know. But I was one of the worst cases that have ever reached those folks. And so my PSA, for lack of a better term, is if you feel something weird, don't feel afraid to go call someone 911 because it may indeed actually save your life. And so thank you for allowing me to say that because I think that's an important thing. And again, I get letters and notes from many people still to this day, people stopping me at the airport, some in tears, saying, you have no idea how much that meant to our family. So for all of you listening, just remember that particular piece. And there's wonderful new technology and tools and medication. I am a personal investor and supporter in a company called Clearly, and Dr. Min, who hopefully at someday, Dean, you'll have on your program because all great paradigms for big disease have moved from being invasive to non-invasive, whether mammography, CT lung scans, and so on. I think he's built something that might indeed help prevent this heart disease deaths that we all experience. Largest killer in America.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I know that's very meaningful advice for all of us, and hearing it from you makes it particularly meaningful. So day 37, the heart attack. You stayed with United, and United stayed with you. What does that say on both sides? Clearly, in the 36 days that preceded it, you had earned a tremendous amount of trust and respect from the employees because of what you were doing, and they it seems that they afforded you that opportunity, that trust, during your illness, and you demonstrated to them that you were with them. I mean, it wouldn't. Many people might have decided, well, perhaps I should do something else, and yet, as you've described, you remained very active. Even before your heart transplant, and certainly afterwards, but you stayed with the company and built the vision. How did that feel personally, and how did those around you come together to really embrace the vision that you'd begun to structure during those 36 days prior to the heart attack?
I don't know that I have a good answer for how people came to embrace it because I think it's such a personal decision for a human to feel part of something and make the personal commitment to say, you know what, I'm going to be part of this as opposed to be a detractor. And so clearly we established that thing. While I don't recommend having a nearly fatal heart attack and a subsequent heart transplant to motivate the troops by any stretch of the imagination, and in my farewell letter to my United family, I think my closing line was something like, I came here to change United, but at the end, United's people changed me. And the most poignant story for me is when I went into the hospital and I was in my deathbed, and recovering, the the correspondence, the letters, the flowers, the food that were flowing to my apartment because nobody knew where I was because kind of I was hidden from public view for a lot of different reasons, uh, were incredibly warm and touching. And again, made even more touching by the fact that I had only been there 36 days.
You were executive chair of United during the first year of COVID-19, when people stopped flying, and there were enormous challenges to your industry, perhaps more to your industry than almost any other. And how did the culture that you'd built in the company help sustain the company through that period? And can you describe the approach to decision making? Because clearly there were lots of difficult decisions that you, the CEO, and other leaders in United had to make during that period where air travel was markedly diminished in the country and in the world.
Yeah, I think to put it in context, 9/11 was obviously a major crisis and issues in the aviation industry. COVID will end up being probably five, maybe even close to 10x the impact. Our business dropped 93% in the first couple of weeks. And the obvious, it's funny because there's crises and then there's emergencies. This one was for us because we do things like this in the aviation industry every single day, right? There's always something breaking somewhere. So first of all, we had a good early sense that this might happen because when the outbreak in North Italy first hit, that was proximate to the U.S., right? Something in South Korea, something in China. That Americans were like, yeah, that's nowhere near us. Italy, that's a lot closer to home. And what we saw immediately is our bookings, people buying tickets, and our load factor, people that actually get on the aircraft, dropped to nearly zero. And that our team immediately sensed it's like this is going to hit the United States quicker than we think, and people are going to stop flying. We need to start making plans. So we immediately went into like a tactical war room. We shut down spending. We immediately went out into the bond market and debt markets to get money to some forces because we knew with no revenue, it was going to be a matter of attrition on your checkbook, right? How much cash do we have? How much cash we're burning, and then begin. So we began before anybody else to really work through that. The next decisions were to how do you treat the employees? How do you keep, do you keep exposing people to this issue, right? Because, we're in airports and people still have to fly medical supplies, medical professionals. And so it was a difficult situation as to how to stage our workforce. So indeed, the business of recovery could happen, both economically and from a medical perspective. So those were decisions. And then even beyond that, we really got into a point of convincing the US government, the Trump administration at the time, that this was real and it was going to have a broader impact, and that the government had to do something to make sure that aviation employees could still stay active so that if we recover, if this ended quickly, we could recover quickly. And so there's a pretty famous picture of me in the cover of the New York Times with my hands spread out like this in front of President Trump, explaining the concept that says, this is going to hit us harder than anything we've ever seen. And we need to start taking and making plans to change our behavioral issues. The concept of masking, the concept of no handshaking, the concept of all of that, as we were talking about that earlier. And so, so many learnings, so many thoughts, so many working with our government, working with our unions who were incredibly supportive. This whole conversation we've been having about how we capture the hearts and minds of our employees, embedded in some of those stories is how we regain the trust of our unions. When we needed them during this particular point, they came out in droves to support the fact that we needed to help with funding to keep aviation open for when the recovery would come. And again, a real quick aside, you can't put a pilot away and then ask him or her to fly a month from now. They have to stay constantly trained for safety reasons. So if you send people home without any kind of thing, it would take, in essence, a month to 2 to 3 months to get us flying again, which would limit an economic recovery and all that. So that was the basic premise of the argument with what it was then became called the CARES Act.
That's great. Well, people are flying and traveling again. I can say that from having recently traveled, and which is great. The industry is recovering. One downside has been we're seeing more bad behavior among customers. and that's affected frontline employees of your airline and others in really horrific ways. How do you build support for the safety of the people who are in contact with your employees who are in contact with the public every day? And what do you think is driving this these outbursts that we're seeing and have been so well publicized?
And both of us and everyone listening to this podcast will have many views and theories on what's causing this sort of behavior, because it's not just on aircraft, right? Crime is up in major cities, murder in particular. The divide in our nation and the way our politicians, all of those things are all part and parcel to the state. I always worry about that. I read somewhere a long time ago that all great civilizations first fall apart from within. And I've always worried about Western civilization beginning to affect that in our country being specific. But that's a whole other different subject. Why people are doing it, there's many reasons. There's frustration, there's political divide, there's different views on masking, on COVID, on vaccines, on pretty much everything. So I think that got some people fired up in some of those cases. But frankly, there's no room for it on an enclosed place. And as an industry, we've always, I think, valued ourselves for competing fiercely on so many fronts, but never on safety. Never on safety. We are never going to say, the dean's airplane is not quite as safe as my airplane, because that hurts the entire industry, right? It's like, who do I believe in? Sure. All that? And so I think the industry came together first and foremost. If you don't wear a mask and you're belligerent about it and you get kicked off my aircraft and my airline, you can't go to the other airline either, because we all banded together to say, any one of you kick anybody off or put on the no-fly list, you don't fly on any of these aircrafts. Just that solidarity, I think, was important.
As you know, I started this podcast to delve more deeply into the subject of leadership and learn the perspectives of innovators in a wide range of disciplines. What do you think are the most important qualities in a leader today?
It's we're always talking about all the different things that people say, but for me, and again, this is my view, it is my style, and therefore it is my opinion, nothing more. And it's the things, depending on the company that you operate, and mine is very people-centric, right? We have, when I started, 100,000 people around the world. Distributed workforce, meaning I don't have a factory floor with everybody in one place you can address. There's so much interaction that has to happen one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-many. And so what I have found that's been useful for me is the concept of empathy, the concept of humility, and certainly authenticity, because I think those are phrases that people use. And another human being knows when you're not being, you're being disingenuous.
For sure.
It's like, oh, Dean, tell me about what your feelings are. Then we're looking around and moving around. This concept of listening is a really important one, because people know when you're actually really listening. So understanding, empathy, humility, putting yourself kind of same place, and then an authentic nature, I think, is always, I think, for me, proven. Now, acumen, smarts, drive, sometimes you got to have a little sharp edge to all of those things are all applicable. But I mean, I think more importantly, it's important that we find who we are as a person and show that person to others. People will always follow you in that regard when they know you're genuine and authentic. And so that's my thoughts.
Great.
Yeah.
Very helpful. In closing, what gives you hope for the future?
Listening to my kids and their generation and the generation that's coming above, they really want to belong to organizations that aren't just profitable, but are principled as well. And I've always said that, at United, we are profitable because we were principled in so many ways. And now we see all these headlines about intolerance and racism and hatred. Most young people under 30 or whatever, they take for granted that a company is going to act ethically and stand up for values. And importantly, I see a lot of, hand-holding as we walk into the future, and hand-holding with someone next to you that's actually very different than you are, grew up differently, looks differently than you, has a whole different view on life. But you know what? I appreciate you. I see you as a human. So I see diversity. I see my boys and their fraternity and the incredible mix. I grew up at a time where I was by far, again, back to the exception, the only brown kid in my fraternity at USC. because that's only people that participated in that. I see so much togetherness and so much focus and so much more appreciation and expectation that companies indeed will be ethical in their value. And so that's what gives me hope, because I think, slowly but surely we're building a future that's going to be a wonderful set of interconnected humanness in this global sphere that we operate in.
Oscar, thank you so much. And thank you for listening to the Minor Consult with me, Stanford School of Medicine Dean Lloyd Minor. I hope you enjoyed today's insightful discussion with business maven and former United CEO Oscar Muñoz. Please send your questions by email to the Minor Consult at theminorconsult.com and check out our website, theminorconsult.com, for episodes, updates, and more. To get the latest episodes of the Minor Consult, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate the podcast 5 stars. Your feedback helps make this podcast happen. Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to our next episode. Until then, stay safe, stay well, and be kind.